This is a response to the insulting Richard Dawkins. People don't necessarily think Richard Dawkins is a deep thinker. In fact, not once have I ever heard him referred to as that. Professor of zoology, atheist, evolutionist, author, Darwinist, holder of the Charles Simonyi seat at Oxford, but never a deep thinker. However, it does follow that Dawkins does possess some intelligence, since he is obviously well educated, has had many peer-reviewed papers published regarding biology, and also lectures at the Royal Society. It seems as if you yourself have labelled Dawkins as a deep thinker in order to some way shoot him down. His identification and work on memes is well renowned and would place him as a great thinker at the very least. The comment wasn't insulting, it was illustrative of the fact that it's absurd to suggest that Dawkins may be wrong when his stance is backed up almost 100% by evidence, and that the alternative to this position, faith, is exactly that. Faith, with nothing to back it up except story and assertion. Dawkins also uses this rebuttal as a way of suggesting that just because you can postulate a question, it doesn't follow that there necessarily has to be an answer to it. Why is a unicorn's horn hollow, for example? He also does give an answer. Anybody could be wrong. We could be wrong about the flying spaghetti monster, he says. So he does admit he could be wrong, but given the evidence, the probability is a lot less than the current alternatives. The question was a little stupid to begin with, hence Dawkins' exasperated reply, and by drawing comparisons to how almost all religions by default must be wrong because there are so many, yet they all claim to be the true word of one single creator. To say Dawkins gets his followers by being insulting to Christians is a stupid statement, and it lends you, sir, no credibility whatsoever. To say the comment was insulting to the audience and then hear their applause doesn't quite fit. Perhaps you should watch again and ask yourself if a huge response of applause really reflects the use of an insult directed at the audience. You're right that Dawkins doesn't care about what Christians think about his lectures. He is simply recounting a lot of what evolutionary science has discovered since Darwin's initial masterpiece was published, and letting people know all about that. People can take it or leave it, but at least what he talks about is evidence-based and can be checked by any individual. He doesn't ask you to take what he says as read. To suggest that people who don't have faith as low-hanging fruit is preposterous. Almost all of the great minds of the 20th century have not had any faith, and most people who are religious have been brought up in a religion, as you say. Figures for people who are brought up in a non-religious household or area and then turn to religion are completely insignificant to those raised as such. Yes, of course the flying spaghetti monster, unicorn and flying teapot have a bearing on a Christian god. They are suggested as a comparison to existing gods, since there is as much evidence that any one of those objects has had any effect on anyone as any god has. Since the effect can't be measured, it could be said that the flying teapot was the cause of the recent earthquakes in Haiti, just as you could say that any god was responsible for the earthquakes in Pakistan. Both have equal merit as statements, since they can't be proved either way, and that is why the comparison was drawn and made to begin with. All the attributes you have given the Christian god in your video are pure assertion, where you have either been told about such things or have read about such things in a book. As mentioned, the vast majority of people are born into and stay with a religion for life. Very few Muslims become Christians. The figures are insignificant in relation, as already mentioned. You refer to the mind-numbed audience later in your video, but earlier you said the audience were insulted. So which is worse? Calling the entire audience mind-numbed is far more insulting than anything Dawkins said. Double standards and clear hypocrisy? Are you religious by any chance? What if there is a God? Well, unless you've been walking around with a blindfold on and earmuffs, it's quite apparent that there is no God, at least not the one that is suggested in holy texts, omniscient, benevolent, omnipotent, etc. You've only got to look at events in the last 10 years to see that that is obviously nonsense. Why devote time to nonsense and improbability? Anyone attending a lecture by Richard Dawkins must already have some insight as to his stance and what he has written about over the past 30 years, even if only in the queue waiting to get into the lecture. Pure mockery? Look at the evidence. Nearly 40,000 Christian sects, each with their own take on the Bible. Potentially 1 million gods known about in the whole of human history. Hinduism alone has several 100,000 gods. It is mocked because it can't be true. It is mocked just as tooth fairies will be mocked in serious discussion. His answer is metaphorical and is said to encourage the person who asked the original question to think about what if you're wrong, because you are far more likely to be wrong, and he illustrates this point. Dawkins doesn't just assert, his work is evidence-based, and that's why he can come across as flippant, because those who challenge him have nothing but hearsay and so-called scripture that itself has been changed, censored and altered depending on cultural and chronological sensitivities over the years, and is most probably man-made to begin with. Oh, and by the way, there isn't any judgment of God, unless you care to show me what that is, and which God you're talking about, the mechanism by which it occurs, and what effect it has. Otherwise we have just another bunch of assertion, which is far more insulting to my intelligence than anything that Richard Dawkins has ever said.